Imagine discovering that your own government had been secretly drugging ordinary people just to see what would happen. Some of the victims were prisoners. Some were psychiatric patients. Others were innocent people who never realized they had become part of an experiment. They were given powerful drugs without their consent. They were watched, manipulated, and pushed to their psychological limits. Then, when the truth was in danger of coming out, thousands of documents were destroyed. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it happened. The program was called MKUltra, and it would become one of the darkest secrets in CIA history. For years, almost nobody outside the agency knew the program existed. The people running it wanted to keep it that way. But then in the middle of the night, a scientist crashed through the closed window of a New York hotel, and suddenly, the secret became much harder to bury. His name was Dr. Frank Olson. Frank was a respected American scientist. He was also a husband and a father of 3. He worked for the United States Army. But his real job was not something he could discuss at the dinner table. Frank was involved in highly classified biological warfare research. His work was so secret that even his family did not fully understand what he did after leaving home each morning. Then came the night of November 28th, 1953. At around 2:30 in the morning, a violent crash shattered the silence inside New York's Statler Hotel. Moments earlier, Frank had been inside, room 1018A. Now he was lying on the pavement, 10 floors below. The window had been closed. Frank's body had crashed through the blinds and the glass. But here is where the story becomes strange. Frank had not been alone. Inside the room was Dr. Robert Lashbrook, a CIA officer who had accompanied Frank to New York. According to Lashbrook, he had been asleep. He claimed that he woke up only after Frank had already gone through the window. To the police, the explanation appeared simple. Frank Olson had suffered a mental breakdown and taken his own life. Case closed. At least, that was the story everyone was expected to believe. Because the police did not know what the CIA had done to Frank 9 days earlier. Frank's wife did not know, and his children would not learn the truth for more than 20 years. To understand what happened inside that hotel room, we have to go back 9 days. Back to November 19th, 1953. Frank had traveled to a secluded cabin beside Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. 10 scientists had gathered there for what appeared to be a routine meeting. Some worked for the United States Army. Others worked for the CIA. Frank worked with both. These men were not strangers. They were Frank's colleagues. They were people he trusted enough to sit beside, share a meal with, and have a drink with. That evening after dinner, a bottle of Cointreau was passed around the room. Frank poured himself a glass. He had no reason to hesitate, but before the bottle reached him, a CIA chemist named Robert Lashbrook had secretly placed LSD inside it. Frank drank approximately 70 micrograms of LSD without knowing it. He had not agreed to take the drug. He did not know it was inside his glass, but the men sitting around him knew, and they said nothing. They simply watched him and waited. For approximately 20 minutes, Frank sat inside that cabin without knowing that he had become the subject of a CIA experiment. Only after the drug had begun entering his system did they finally tell him the truth. By then, it was already too late. Over the following days, Frank began to change. He became frightened, anxious, and deeply suspicious of the people around him. His colleagues tried to calm him down. Then, when his condition became worse, the CIA took him to New York. 9 days after drinking from that glass, Frank Olson was dead. For the next 22 years, his family was told almost nothing about what had really happened. But Frank's death was only the first crack in a much larger secret, because behind that single glass of LSD was a hidden network stretching through hospitals, prisons, universities, and secret CIA safe houses. And Frank Olson was far from the only person trapped inside it. So why would the CIA do this? Why would it secretly drug its own people and then sit back to watch what happened? The answer begins with fear. In the early 1950s, the Cold War was growing more dangerous by the day. The Soviet Union had built an atomic bomb. Communist China had taken control of the world's most populated country, and American soldiers were fighting a brutal war in Korea. Then something strange began to happen. Some American prisoners of war appeared in communist propaganda videos. They criticized the United States. Some confessed to crimes their government denied committing, and when these soldiers finally returned home, many Americans believed they had been brainwashed. Inside the CIA, those fears became an obsession. What if the Soviet Union or China had discovered a way to control the human mind? What if they could break a prisoner without leaving visible injuries? What if they could erase memories, force someone to reveal secrets, or even make a person act against their own will? There was no solid evidence that the communists possessed a magical mind-controlled drug. But the CIA did not want to take that risk. If the enemy had discovered such a weapon, America wanted one too. The agency had already experimented with drugs, hypnosis, and unusual interrogation techniques under earlier programs known as Bluebird and Artichoke. But those programs were only the beginning. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved something much larger. MKUltra. One of the men near the center of the new program was Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was a CIA chemist, and he had also helped organize the secret LSD experiment that ended with Frank Olson's death. But Gottlieb and his team were not simply searching for a truth serum. Their ambitions went much further. They wanted a substance that could make someone talk, something that could create confusion, erase memories, or destroy a person's ability to resist. They wanted to know whether a person could be controlled through drugs, hypnosis, isolation, sleep deprivation, or electroshock. And they wanted to discover whether a human personality could be broken apart, then rebuilt into something new. LSD seemed like the perfect place to begin. At the time, the drug was still surrounded by mystery. A tiny amount could completely change what a person saw, heard, felt, and believed was real. To the CIA, that made LSD more than a drug. It made it a possible weapon. But there was a problem. Testing LSD on volunteers could only reveal so much. A volunteer knew they had taken a drug. No matter how frightening the experience became, they understood that the visions and strange thoughts would eventually end. But someone who had been drugged secretly would have no explanation. They might believe they were losing their mind, and that was exactly the reaction the CIA wanted to observe. Frank Olson's death should have ended the experiments. The agency now knew that secretly giving LSD to someone could cause panic, psychological collapse, serious injury, or even death. CIA officials criticized the men involved for using poor judgment, but nobody was truly held responsible, and the experiments did not stop. Instead, they became easier to hide. The CIA began moving its research through a secret network of hospitals, prisons, universities, private foundations, and outside researchers. Sometimes, even the scientists performing the experiments did not know who was really paying them. The money passed through front organizations. The CIA's name remained hidden, and MKUltra continued to grow. Years later, investigators discovered records connected to 149 sub-projects and 80 different institutions. But even those numbers could not reveal the full scale of the program. Many experiments had never been properly recorded. Some files had disappeared, and the most important MKUltra documents would eventually be destroyed. The surviving records showed that the CIA explored far more than LSD. The agency studied hypnosis, electroshock, memory, sleep, isolation, and different ways of changing human behavior. But some of the most disturbing experiments began in a surprisingly ordinary way. A man would walk into a bar. A stranger would begin a friendly conversation. The man might be offered a drink and invited to continue the evening somewhere more private. He would have no idea that he had just been selected for a CIA experiment. He would not know that the person sitting beside him was working with the government, and he would never see the men hiding behind a two-way mirror, watching, taking notes, and waiting for the drug to take effect. The operation had a name that sounded almost too strange to be real: Midnight Climax. During the 1950s, the CIA secretly prepared apartments in San Francisco and New York. From the outside, they looked completely ordinary, but inside, the rooms had been carefully designed for surveillance. There were red curtains, unusual decorations, recording equipment, and two-way mirrors built into the walls. Behind those mirrors sat CIA observers. They could see everything happening inside the room, but the person being watched could not see them. The plan was simple. Women working with the operation would meet unsuspecting men and bring them back to one of the apartments. The men believed they were there for a private encounter. They had no idea that they had just entered a secret CIA testing site. At some point, a drug would be slipped into their food or drink. Sometimes it was LSD. The victim was never asked for permission. There was no medical examination. No doctor stood nearby, and there was nobody to help if something went wrong. The CIA officers simply watched from behind the mirror, while the victim slowly lost control of his own mind. Imagine being inside that room. You take a drink. At first, everything feels normal. Then the walls seem to move. Colors become brighter. Sounds begin to bend and stretch. Your thoughts no longer feel like your own. You do not know that you have taken a drug. You do not know that someone is studying you. And you have no idea that men are sitting only a few feet away, recording every moment. To the CIA, that fear was useful. They wanted to know how an ordinary person would react when reality suddenly stopped making sense. Would he reveal personal information? Would he become easier to manipulate? Could he be embarrassed, controlled, or blackmailed? And most importantly, would he understand what had been done to him? The answer was usually no. When the experience ended, the victims were sent back into their normal lives. They were not told that they had participated in an experiment. They were not examined by doctors, and the CIA made no serious attempt to discover whether they suffered any long-term damage. Some subjects became ill for hours or even days. At least one person reportedly required hospitalization. But because the victims had been chosen at random, the CIA often had no safe way to contact them afterward. That meant the agency could drug someone, watch the immediate reaction, and then simply lose track of them. Nobody knows exactly how many people passed through these apartments. The surviving records do not provide a complete number, and many of the most important documents were later destroyed. That uncertainty was not an accident. The people selected for these experiments were often chosen because they were unlikely to report what had happened. Some would have been too confused, others might have been too embarrassed, and even if they went to the police, who would believe them? A man would have to explain that he followed a stranger into an apartment, drank something, began hallucinating, and somehow believed the CIA was watching him from behind the wall. It sounded impossible, and that made it the perfect crime. The experiments continued for years, even after Frank Olson died, even after CIA officials understood how dangerous LSD could be. The operation was not producing reliable science. The observers were often not trained medical professionals. The conditions were uncontrolled, and there was almost no meaningful follow-up. But the CIA continued anyway. Because Midnight Climax was not only about understanding LSD, it also taught the agency how drugs could be delivered without someone noticing. how a room could be prepared for secret observation, and how easily an ordinary person could be turned into an experiment without ever realizing it. Years later, when the operation was exposed during government investigations, even CIA officials struggled to explain exactly what had happened inside those rooms. Records were incomplete, names had been hidden, and the people who knew the most either could not remember, refused to speak, or were never questioned. But the surviving evidence was clear enough. The CIA had secretly drugged people inside the United States. It had watched them through hidden mirrors, and it had done all of this without their knowledge or consent. Yet the safe houses were only one part of MKUltra. Because while CIA officers were secretly observing people inside apartments, doctors working in respected hospitals and universities were conducting experiments of their own. And in one psychiatric hospital in Canada, a doctor believed he could completely erase a human personality, then build a new one in its place. The hospital was called the Allen Memorial Institute. It stood on a hill above Montreal, Canada, inside a mansion that looked more like a castle than a psychiatric clinic. Patients came there because they believed they would be helped. Many were struggling with serious mental health conditions. They trusted the doctors, they trusted the hospital, and they had no idea that money connected to the CIA had entered the building. The doctor leading the research was Donald Ewan Cameron. Cameron was not an unknown figure working in some hidden basement. He was one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world. But Cameron had developed a disturbing theory. He believed that before a damaged mind could be repaired, the person's existing patterns had to be destroyed. Memories, habits, emotional responses, even the basic sense of identity that made someone who they were. Cameron called this process depatterning. His goal was to return the patient's mind to an almost empty state. Then, once the old personality had been erased, he believed a healthier personality could be placed inside. To the CIA, this idea was impossible to ignore. The agency had been searching for ways to break resistance, erase memories, and influence human behavior. Cameron believed he could do all three. Beginning in the late 1950s, CIA money was secretly directed toward his research through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Cameron may not have known exactly where the money came from, but the CIA knew what kind of work it was supporting, and the patients were never told that American intelligence had any connection to their treatment. What happened next sounds less like therapy and more like an attempt to erase a human being. Some patients were given LSD and other powerful drugs. Some were placed into prolonged drug-induced sleep. They could remain asleep for days at a time, waking only for food, water, and basic care. Then came the electroshock treatments. Electroconvulsive therapy was already being used in psychiatry. But Cameron pushed it far beyond ordinary treatment. Some patients received repeated, unusually intense sessions designed not simply to treat their symptoms, but to break down the patterns of memory and behavior inside their minds. The desired result was a patient who no longer knew where they were. Someone who could not remember why they had entered the hospital. Someone who might struggle to recognize familiar people or perform simple daily tasks. But for Cameron, erasing the old personality was only the first step. Next came what he called psychic driving. A recorded message would be played again and again, sometimes for as long as 16 hours a day. The same words repeated hundreds, even thousands of times. Some messages focused on the patient's fears and perceived failures. Others contained positive statements, meant to build a new pattern of thought. The patient might hear the same voice in the morning, the same sentence in the afternoon, the same message throughout the night. Again and again and again. Cameron believed repetition could force these messages deep into the mind. First destroy the old personality, then replace it with a new one. At least, that was the theory. In reality, many patients did not leave the hospital with new and improved personalities. Some left with serious memory loss. Some had difficulty returning to normal life. Families later described loved ones who had forgotten important parts of their past, lost basic abilities, or returned home as completely different people. And the most disturbing part was that these were not enemy spies. They were not captured soldiers. They were patients. People who had entered a hospital expecting treatment and found themselves inside an experiment they did not understand. The CIA documents that survived describe LSD, repeated verbal messages, sensory isolation, and extended periods of drug-induced sleep. One record stated that more than 100 cases had been completed. But even the surviving files could not answer the most important questions. How much did every patient know? How many truly understood what they were agreeing to? And how many lives were permanently changed? Cameron's work did not prove that a personality could be erased and successfully rebuilt. It did prove something else. With enough authority, secrecy, and money, patients could be subjected to extreme experiments while the people paying for them remained hidden. And the Allen Memorial Institute was not the only place where this happened. MKUltra also reached into American prisons. There, researchers found another group of people who were easy to control, easy to isolate, and difficult for the outside world to hear. Prisoners. And in one experiment, a man would be given LSD repeatedly for more than 2 months. At the end of the last chapter, we said one man was given LSD for more than 2 months. The truth was worse. It was not one man. It was a group of men. The experiments took place at a federal addiction hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. Many of the subjects were former morphine users who were confined inside the institution. The researcher in charge was Dr. Harris Isbell. On paper, his work was described as scientific research into addiction, tolerance, and the effects of experimental drugs. But behind that research was a connection the subjects did not fully understand. The CIA was interested in the results. The agency wanted to know what repeated exposure to LSD would do to a human mind. How quickly would the body develop tolerance? How much could the dose be increased? And what would happen when the drug was suddenly taken away? In one experiment, a group of men received LSD for 77 consecutive days. 11 weeks. Day after day, the drug entered their bodies. As their tolerance increased, larger amounts were required to produce the same effect. The study was later published in a medical journal. The men were described as research subjects. Their reactions were measured. Their tolerance was recorded, but their names disappeared from the story. We know what the researchers learned from them. We know far less about what happened to the men afterward. And Lexington was not the only institution involved. Drug experiments connected to MKUltra also reached federal prisons and other controlled facilities. Prisoners appeared to offer researchers the perfect environment. They could be watched, their movements could be controlled, and they could not simply walk away whenever they wanted. Some prisoners were told that they were participating in drug research, but they were not always told who was truly funding it or why the government wanted the information. That raises an uncomfortable question. Can a person inside a prison ever give completely free consent? Especially when the people controlling their daily life are also offering them a place in an experiment. The CIA was supposed to be studying how enemies might control prisoners. Instead, it was using people inside American institutions to develop the same knowledge. Researchers tested more than LSD. Different programs examined sedatives, stimulants, hallucinogens, and combinations of drugs intended to confuse or weaken a subject. One method involved giving a person a sedative until they became drowsy. Then, as they began to fall asleep, a stimulant would be introduced. The result could leave the subject drifting between exhaustion and agitation, confused, disoriented, and possibly easier to question. The CIA also studied hypnosis. Could someone be placed into a trance and ordered to perform an action they would normally refuse? Could hypnosis be combined with drugs? Could a person be made to forget what had happened? Again and again, the agency returned to the same dream. A controllable human being. Someone who could be made to reveal secrets, change loyalties, or carry out an order without understanding why. But after years of experiments, the CIA kept running into the same problem. Human beings were unpredictable. LSD did not create reliable obedience. One person might become talkative, another might panic, another might become silent, suspicious, or impossible to control. The drug could break someone down, but it could not reliably rebuild them into whatever the CIA wanted. MKUltra never produced the perfect mind control weapon its creators imagined. But that does not mean the program failed to cause damage. Real people lost memories. Real people suffered psychological breakdowns, and many never learned why their lives had suddenly changed. By the 1960s, even some people inside the CIA were questioning the program. They knew the experiments created serious legal and ethical problems. They knew American citizens had been placed at risk. They knew public exposure could become a disaster. Yet secrecy continued to protect the program. For years, MKUltra remained hidden behind coded documents, front organizations, and classified payments. Then, in 1973, the men who knew the program best were preparing to leave the CIA. Sidney Gottlieb was retiring. CIA Director Richard Helms was also leaving. And before they walked away, they made one final decision. The MKUltra files had to disappear. In January of 1973, the order was given: destroy the files. According to later testimony, Sidney Gottlieb carried out the verbal instructions of CIA Director Richard Helms. Boxes of records were removed. Documents were shredded. Years of experiments, names, payments, locations, and decisions disappeared with them. There was no complete list of every victim, no reliable record of every drug that had been administered, no way to know how many people had been harmed. And that was the point. If the files no longer existed, the full story could never be reconstructed. For a while, the plan worked. Then, in 1975, investigations into illegal CIA activities began exposing pieces of the program. For the first time, the American public learned that the agency had secretly tested drugs on people without their knowledge. One of the cases described an unnamed army scientist who had been given LSD, then died after falling from a hotel window. Frank Olson's family immediately recognized the story. For 22 years, they had been told that Frank had suffered a sudden mental breakdown and taken his own life. Now they learned that the CIA had secretly drugged him only days before his death. They learned that Robert Lashbrook, the man sharing Frank's hotel room, was a CIA officer connected to the experiment. And they learned that the government had known the truth from the beginning. In July of 1975, President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. He apologized on behalf of the United States government. The family later received a financial settlement of $750,000. But an apology could not return the missing 22 years, and it could not answer the question that had followed the family since the night Frank died. Did Frank Olson jump from that window? Or was there more to his death than the official story admitted? His family never stopped asking. The surviving evidence does not provide a final answer, and most of the records that might have helped were already gone. By that point, investigators believed they had uncovered as much of MKUltra as they ever would. The files had been destroyed. The officials involved claimed they could not remember the details. The full truth appeared to be lost. Then, something unexpected happened. In March of 1977, a CIA employee searching through retired records found 7 boxes of documents. They had survived by mistake. The papers had been stored with budget and financial records, instead of being filed under the name MKUltra. Because they were in the wrong place, they escaped the destruction order. Inside the boxes were nearly 8,000 pages, checks, invoices, funding requests, names of researchers, names of institutions, and references to experiments that investigators had never fully understood. The new documents revealed a program far larger than the public had been told. They connected MKUltra to 149 sub-projects. They identified 185 outside researchers and assistants. And they pointed toward dozens of universities, hospitals, research foundations, pharmaceutical companies, and prisons. Some researchers knew they were working with the CIA. Others did not. Some subjects knew they were participating in experiments. Others had no idea, and because most of the operational files had been destroyed, investigators still could not identify every victim. In August of 1977, the United States Senate held a public hearing. CIA Director Stansfield Turner sat before the committee and admitted that the newly discovered records revealed more than the agency had previously disclosed. Senators asked how many people had been drugged. There was no complete answer. They asked what happened inside the safe houses. The answers were incomplete. They asked who had been harmed. The CIA did not know. The men who had created the program were still alive. But when questioned, their memories often appeared to fail them. They could not remember specific experiments. They could not remember names. They could not remember exactly how many people had been used. After years of detailed secret research, the people responsible suddenly remembered very little, and that is why the true scale of MKUltra remains unknown. We know that people were drugged without consent. We know that prisoners and psychiatric patients were used in experiments. We know the CIA secretly funded research through front organizations. We know that Frank Olson died after being given LSD without his knowledge, and we know that the agency destroyed most of the evidence. But we do not know every name. We do not know every experiment. We do not know how many victims returned home, confused, frightened, or permanently changed, without ever learning why. MKUltra did not create the perfect mind control weapon the CIA had imagined. It could not reliably erase a personality and replace it with another. It could not turn an ordinary person into a perfectly obedient agent, but the program revealed something just as disturbing. The CIA did not need to control a person's mind to destroy their life. It only needed secrecy, a frightened government, a group of officials who believed the rules did not apply to them, and victims the world was unlikely to believe. The most frightening part of MKUltra is not that the CIA discovered how to control the human mind. It is how many human minds it was willing to break while trying. For most people, the public hearings marked the end of the MKUltra story. For Frank Olson's family, they marked the beginning of a new investigation. The government had admitted that Frank was secretly given LSD. It had admitted that the experiment was connected to his death. But Frank's sons still did not believe they had been told everything. The official story said their father had jumped through the hotel window during a psychological crisis. Yet important questions remained. Why had Frank been taken to New York by CIA personnel? Why was he sharing a hotel room with Robert Lashbrook? Why did Lashbrook give conflicting accounts of what he had seen? And why had the government hidden the LSD experiment from the family for 22 years? In 1994, Frank Olson's body was exhumed. The family hired forensic experts to examine his remains. One expert reported finding evidence of an injury to Frank's head that may have occurred before he went through the window. To the family, this discovery suggested that Frank might not have jumped voluntarily, but it did not prove exactly what happened inside room 1018A. No witness provided a complete account. No hidden film was discovered, and many of the records had already been destroyed. The New York investigation was eventually reopened. Frank's cause of death was later changed from suicide to unknown. That single word may be the most honest ending his story has ever received. Unknown. We know how Frank entered the hotel. We know who was inside the room with him. We know the CIA had secretly drugged him 9 days earlier. But we still do not know exactly how he left that window. The people responsible for MKUltra never faced a public trial over the full program. Sidney Gottlieb testified about the experiments, but claimed he could not remember many important details. By the time the surviving documents were discovered, the program had been scattered across decades, institutions, and people who had every reason to remain silent. Some victims eventually received compensation. Many received nothing. Some learned years later that their suffering had been connected to secret government research. Others may have died without ever knowing. And this is where the story of MKUltra becomes larger than LSD, mind control, or the CIA. Because the program forces us to ask a much simpler question. What happens when a government becomes so afraid of its enemies that it begins treating its own people like the enemy? MKUltra was created in the name of national security. The people behind it believed they were protecting the United States from a terrifying new weapon. But fear allowed them to cross one line after another. First, they experimented on volunteers, then on prisoners and psychiatric patients, then on people who had never agreed to participate at all. Eventually, ordinary citizens became nothing more than opportunities for testing. The program remained hidden because every person involved could claim they were responsible for only one small piece. A scientist conducted research, a foundation transferred money, a CIA officer approved a payment, a doctor administered a treatment, and somewhere between all of those people, the victim disappeared. That may be the most important lesson left behind by MKUltra. History's darkest programs are not always created by one person making one monstrous decision. Sometimes they are built from hundreds of smaller decisions, made by people who convince themselves that the next step is necessary. Frank Olson entered a cabin believing he was surrounded by colleagues. He trusted them enough to share a drink. 9 days later, he was dead, more than 70 years later. His family still does not have every answer, and perhaps they never will. Because most of the truth about MKUltra was not lost, it was deliberately destroyed. What survived is only a fragment, and if that fragment contains secret drugging, psychological destruction, hidden observation rooms, and experiments on people who never consented, then we are left with one final question. What was inside the files that did not survive? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel for more true stories hidden inside classified files. And tell us in the comments, what should our next documentary be about? Because some secrets disappear forever, others are simply waiting to be found.